Warning: I do not believe in race to be an absolute truth. It is a social and historical reality. The videos presented are nothing more than a response to a racial reality that I did not invent, nor do I wish to perpetuate. It may only seem racial because it is defending what has always been racial, and that is the whitewashing of history. This video is a response to the video on my page entitled Africans Freed Themselves from Slavery, Part 3. It has recently gained a lot of views, but seemingly in the hands of people who seem to be very upset by the possibility that what they have been told in the past about Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War may have omitted a lot of truth, if not been an outright lie. There also seems to be a lot of backlash, because for some reason, which I will attempt to explain in a bit, this same type of person who is disturbed by the shattering of the perfect image of Honest Abe also doesn't like the idea that the video gives agency to Africans in their own liberation. But I get it. There are generally three typical responses from this type of naysayer to this not-so-typical information. Usually, in my opinion, to mitigate a subconscious guilt in which they have built up inside, which I think they should not have, unless they feel like they themselves have done something wrong to the subject at hand, the African and their descendants. One of the typical responses is that so-called white people actually freed the slaves. The second typical response, in order to mitigate their guilt, is that the West continues to be stewards of freedom around the world while the non-Western countries are not. Lastly, also in order to mitigate their guilt, they make the claim that Africans were enslaving their own people. In this video, I will address all these points for those that lack the wherewithal to read a book, visit the archives, or to think outside of the propaganda box. For the first claim that white people freed the slaves, people are generally discussing, as they do here in the United States, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the majority white Union soldiers who participated in the Civil War. For the other parts of the world, they reference Great Britain, who spearheaded the European abolitionist movement with the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, which consists of the trade in ships from Africa, and their general abolition in all its colonies by 1834. They also reference the Western world in general, citing Europe's stoppage of the institution of slavery throughout the 19th century as evidence of their humanitarian progressiveness and the Western, and let's be real here, white people, moral superiority. This claim is also an effort to mitigate the white guilt that seems to pervade the subconscious and conscious minds of the people who live as beneficiaries of such a system. However, I find a lot of contradictions and circular arguments in these claims. In order to understand the general claim that Africans liberated themselves from slavery, one must first have an ontological paradigm shift in their thinking. The two major vantage points of examining history are from a de jure standpoint and a de facto standpoint. De jure is what is legal and set in stone by those one may perceive to be legitimate authorities. De facto is what is reality on the ground despite what the legal authorities issue. For example, just because murder is illegal doesn't mean that it is not happening. Those making the circular claim that whites freed the slaves always view history from a de jure standpoint. They look at a myriad of legal emancipation dates associated with white countries throughout the 19th century, and then they use this as evidence of the white man liberating black people. And when one brings up the many cases of Africans fighting for their own liberation before these emancipation dates, or to achieve these emancipation dates through revolt, the naysayers would say that they could not have freed themselves without the white man putting his stamp on it. So you're saying that freedom can only come from the state which happens to be white, right? So unless these Africans completely obliterated the notion of the modern state, then they could never have freed themselves. Okay. So in order for black people to be free, the white-owned state only has the authority to do it. In philosophy, this kind of circular logic is what they call positivism, when things can only be valid if authority says so. In order for one to fully understand the nuances of history and not this simplistic version that has been fed to the people to mitigate their guilt, as well as distance the horrors of the past to the present, one must look at history from a de facto perspective, which has been avoided rather than the de jure or positivist approach, which sadly has been the primary method of capturing the past. When history is examined from a de facto lens, one would see that Africans who were enslaved in the Americas collectively found freedom for themselves in spite of their European colonial enemies' legitimization of this freedom. It is like me getting kidnapped and locked up in someone's basement and subsequently breaking free. But because my captor makes a claim that I am not free, I define myself by my captor's desires? That just doesn't make any sense. And the captor, in this sense, is the modern state. With so many modern slaves, or what we euphemistically call citizens, today fail to comprehend. Not only have people found freedom for themselves before the emancipation dates, but people have found themselves enslaved and still are enslaved all over the world after legal emancipation of the 19th century. So the abolition dates that these types often cite are nothing more than distractions from the reality. And the reality is that statism equals slavery. Now, I will get back to this statement later. Now, how was this freedom accomplished? It was accomplished by slave revolts and establishing what were known as maroon communities. The word maroon has its origins in the Spanish term cimarrón. Cimarrón was the word used to describe runaway cattle in early Spanish America. The term was later used to describe enslaved Africans who escaped the plantations and mines of Latin America and established free communities in which they defended. These communities, found all throughout the Americas, varied in size and in intent. They were not all the same. Some were short-lived, with only a few people, lasting only a few days, while others retained tens of thousands of people and are still in existence after hundreds of years, outlasting the institution of slavery itself. These maroon communities, to name a few, consisted of the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia, North Carolina, the Black Seminoles, or Maroons of Florida, the Jamaican Maroons, Dominica's Maroons, Cuban Maroons, Quilombo do Palmage of Brazil, San Lorenzo de los Negros in Mexico, also known as Yanga, San Basilio de Palenque in Colombia, the Saramaka of Suriname, and there were also a myriad of maroon villages that splintered off from the aforementioned that still exist until this day, with populations numbering in the millions throughout the Americas. These self-emancipators not only liberated themselves and their brethren from slavery, but also resisted the invasiveness of the colonial state that were not only perceived by blacks as takers of freedom, but by whites as well. In fact, even whites escaped to the maroon communities at times in order to escape the draconian policies of the colonial state. In reality, true freedom was not found under the state, it was found outside of it. And even those that did not find their freedom in maroon communities engaged in slave revolts that ultimately led to the state pushing towards the legal termination of slavery, like Dominica's Joint Maroon and Enslaved Revolt of 1814, the Busa Revolt in Barbados in 1816, the Demerara Slave Rebellion in 1823, the Baptiste slave revolt in Jamaica in 1832, which ultimately led to the legal abolition of slavery 1 year later in the British Empire. But going back to the topic of maroons, this brings me to the next point about some of the contradictory arguments of the white savior complex. Let's take the YouTube philosopher by the name of Stephen Molyneux, for example. He is a self-proclaimed anarcho-libertarian who once made a video making the argument that statism equals slavery. Now, you see, I can get with that. I understood very well where he was coming from when he states that taxation is theft, the military draft is slavery, and the government is a coercive institution that operates on pure violence. However, he then makes a video a couple of years later entitled The Truth About Slavery, where he makes the argument that because slavery has been practiced all over the world by all races, and that all races have been victims of it, there should be no race-based reparations because it only divides people. Now look, I understand the conclusion that he reached. However, he loses me in his method of reaching that conclusion when he states that Western European states, and what they mean by West is white people, ended slavery, while he proceeded to argue that it is the non-Western countries that perpetuate the institution, which, ironically, in essence, is a race-based argument. If it is the West that has abolished slavery, but are the same ones that proceeded to generate the creation of the modern state as we know it through aggressive colonization and imperialism, how is it that Molyneux and others give them all the credit for ending the institution when, according to him, statism equals slavery? This is why true freedom was found in the maroon communities, the palenques, the quilombos, etc. Furthermore, these types of propagandists proceed to credit Abraham Lincoln of the United States and William Wilberforce of Great Britain for their selfless humanitarianism of quote-unquote ending slavery. In addition, when those like Molyneux harp on the abolition movements and subsequent abolition of slavery in the West and completely ignore African abolitionist movements, the abolition of the slave trade, the non-practice of the institution by pre-colonial African nations, or even the anti-state societies that existed in West Africa and throughout the diaspora, it demonstrates the extreme partiality of his arguments. Just like the British have their dates of abolition of 1807 and 1834, West African nations have theirs as well. The Benin Kingdom abolished the slave trade from their country in 1516. The Kingdom of the Congo wrote the King of Portugal to come to an agreement to stop the enslavement of Congo free citizens in 1526, when the Portuguese merchants and the African merchant collaborators broke the Congo law by selling more than only criminals and prisoners of war. And then there was the Battle of Mbandakasi, when the Congo victory forced the Portuguese to retrieve over 1,000 people taken to Brazil illegally in the 1620s. There was also the Baga of Guinea, who refused to participate in the slave trade. Then there were the many anti-state egalitarian societies like the Igbo or the Ewe, which lacked hierarchy and in essence were not slave societies. You see, though I just spewed out many examples of Africans abolishing slavery and fighting against the institution, that does not mean that slavery and kidnapping ended in Africa. This seems to be the logic that those types make about Europe and their abolition movements. Just because the state claims that it ended slavery doesn't mean that it ended. But Western European abolition movements were nothing more than trickery. As we look at abolition dates of the 19th century, we can also see that those same countries and the people within those countries found new ways to enslave people around the world without actually calling it slavery. You see, in this supercilious push for abolition and humanitarianism, Europeans enslaved Africans in the name of freeing them. For example, King Leopold II of Belgium organized the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885 to convince the other European nations of the importance of civilizing and saving the Africans from themselves and Arab slave traders. The King of Belgium proceeded to make the claims to a piece of real estate 1/4 the size of the United States, and euphemistically named this land in the middle of Africa the Congo Free State. I say euphemistically because the Congo Free State became the exact opposite of a free state. After 2 decades of King Leopold's ownership of this land, he enslaved millions of people, in which 10 million people died, and reduced the Congo population by about 50%. But this was supposed to be the European idea of freedom, right? Because they put a halt to the enslavement of Africans by other Africans and Arabs. Other notable members of this Berlin Conference consisted of the British, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Italians, and the Germans. Though many of these European nations did not commit the degree of atrocities that the Belgian king had committed to the Congolese people, the violence of colonialism to rip away people's land and their ability to independently feed and clothe themselves was lost with this new repressive state structure. Another example of humanitarian proclamations proving to be nothing more than a ploy to use the state to monopolize on exploitation and slavery is when the British abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. You see, the British had the most powerful navy in the world at the time. They also experienced a decade of incessant slave rebellions in their colonies and the neighboring colonies throughout the 1790s, including the Haitian Revolution, which resulted in an independent nation of ex-slaves. After the British officially abolished the transatlantic slave trade, they policed the high seas and condemned and confiscated the slave cargo on ships that were traveling across the Atlantic Ocean illegally. But the British would not return the captives to their homelands in Africa. The British would send these quote-unquote liberated Africans to their own colonies to serve as indentured servants either in the West Indies or Sierra Leone in West Africa. In fact, the British used to use the term captured Africans to refer to those who were taken and condemned on ships by the British until they euphemistically decided to change the term to liberated Africans when creating the Liberated African Department in Sierra Leone. You see, the British, who were essentially the police of the world, holding the most powerful navy, retained a virtual monopoly on might. They ultimately eliminated their competition under the moral guise that they are promoting abolition. Similar to the way that the U.S. government fights the war on drugs while historically participating in the drug trade. There were 100,000 Africans on condemned ships that made their way to Sierra Leone between 1807 and 1867. There were also the so-called Indian indentured servants who started to be imported into the British West Indies in 1838, the same year that the apprenticeship of the enslaved Africans had expired. Many of these indentured servants were forced into servitude, some of them tricked, and many lived a life accumulating perpetual debt that kept them in bondage for the rest of their lives. Between the years of 1834 and 1917, there were a total of 2 million indentured Indians shipped into the British West Indies and other parts of the British colonial empire. Despite the British proclamation of abolition in 1834, the British colony of India continued to practice legal slavery. In 1842, the number of slaves in British colonial India was estimated at somewhere between 5 to 10 million people. The enslaved in India were not freed until 1848, and the owning of slaves in India was not considered an offense until 1862. In the British Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana in West Africa, the British did not abolish slavery until 1928 in that colony. David Eltis, a historian on the transatlantic slave trade, writes, "The flow of British resources into the slave trade did not cease in 1807. After this date, British subjects owned, managed, and manned slaving adventurers. They purchased newly imported Africans in the Americas. They supplied ships, equipment, and most important of all, trade goods and credit to foreign slave traders. Even the success of the British economy was inextricably linked to the slavery in the American South well into the 1860s. For example, 40% of all British exports were cotton textiles, and 75% of this cotton was from the United States slavery-driven South." So that's Britain, right? So this brings me to my next point about the United States. Even when the American Civil War was fought, it was not fought to end slavery by Lincoln, but to preserve the Union. After a long tradition of maroonage, slave revolts, and Maroons fighting wars against the United States military, as they had done in Florida and Virginia, Africans took advantage of the opportunity to fight on the side of their enemy's enemy during the Civil War. Lincoln even stated, before he was president, that he had no purpose to introduce political and social equality between white and black races. Lincoln stated after he was elected during his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. After the Southern states started to secede from the Union and Lincoln proceeded to go to war with the South, African Americans continued with their tradition of resistance and took advantage of this opportunity to liberate themselves by the tens of thousands, despite the laws forbidding them to do so. Lincoln even stated in a private letter to Horace Greeley that if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Lincoln's main objective was not to free the slaves. It was to save the Union. It was not until Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and his Gettysburg Address in 1863 that the narrative of the Union started to change. By the end of the war, there were 200,000 black soldiers comprising of 10% of the Union military, despite laws against blacks joining the military dating back to 1792. At least 11 of them were women disguised as men. There were hundreds of thousands of self-liberated black Americans that served as laborers. While many whites were avoiding the draft by engaging in draft riots, blacks insisted on joining the fight because they saw this as an opportunity to fight against their captors. The resistance to enslavement by the self-emancipators motivated Congress and the President to pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, except if one has been convicted of a crime. You see, despite these efforts of the African Americans to liberate themselves, the government found new ways to get these formerly enslaved back on plantations or in industrial mines through black codes and the convict leasing system. Blacks were put in prison for violating vagrancy laws, loitering, unlawful assembly, owning a gun, looking at a white woman the wrong way, not being employed, and being at the wrong place at the wrong time. The convict leasing system, centered in the South but profited northern Gilded Age corporations, lasted from the end of the Civil War all the way until the Second World War. U.S. Steel and other Gilded Age corporations purchased prison labor from the state. The black prison laborers were whipped, abused, tortured, and many of them would not make it out of the prison mines alive. Douglas Blackman writes about this. He asks, what would be revealed if American corporations were examined through the same sharp lens of historical confrontation as the one then being trained on German corporations that relied on Jewish slave labor during World War II and the Swiss banks that robbed victims of the Holocaust of their fortunes? One example that Blackman writes about is in Alabama where, quote, during 1888 and 1889, 7 of the black laborers forced into the Slope No. 2 mine were children under the age of 10. Prison inspection reports indicated that among nearly 1,100 men brought there, only 1/3 could read. Fewer than 40 had prior criminal records. Of the 116 who died, a large number were teenagers, close quote. Even when they did away with the convict leasing system in the mid-20th century, emerging were new forms of economic exploitation and social control of the poor and black. The war on drugs declared by President Richard Nixon and waged by President Ronald Reagan increased the prison population in the United States of nonviolent offenders. In fact, the war on drugs was waged before there was a crack epidemic in the United States, and it was the CIA who, in 1998, admitted to importing drugs into the United States throughout the 1980s to fund the Contra War in Nicaragua, when the same government was claiming to be fighting a war against this drug operation. With the war on drugs came the no-knock raids, civil asset forfeiture laws where government can confiscate one's belongings with no recourse under the law, as well as Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act, which militarized the police. And as a result of these splendid policies, the U.S. prison population in the United States grew from 300,000 in 1980 to more than 2 million by the year 2010. And actually, as crime was going down in this country, the prison population was actually growing. The United States now incarcerates more of its citizens than any country in the world. The United States is 4% of the world's population, but comprises of 25% of the world's prison population. And what are these prisoners doing in prison? Well, they are slaving for private corporations who, instead of shipping jobs overseas, use prison labor the same way that U.S. Steel did in the early 1900s. And interestingly, When statistics are taken for slave labor found around the world in the modern day, the United States prison population is never considered. Not only did the U.S. find ways to enslave the descendants of former American slaves with new systems, but many of the former slave owners of the South after the Civil War took their slave trading expertise to the Pacific to kidnap and enslave black and brown Melanesian and Polynesian people from their homelands in a practice known as blackbirding. This practice occurred between 1863 and 1904, and it is estimated that around 100,000 people were kidnapped from their homelands and taken to Fiji or Queensland, Australia during that 40-year period. Now look at the year, 1863. The year blackbirding begins is the same year as the Emancipation Proclamation. And as blackbirding was coming to an end by 1900, the United States found new exploits in the violent conquest of the Philippines and Hawaii. Liberia is yet another example of post-emancipation modern slavery benefiting U.S. corporations. Liberia was a colony of freed slaves in West Africa established by the American Colonization Society in 1821 and receiving their independence from the United States in 1847. However, though they were technically independent, they were virtually a neo-colony of the United States. In 1926, in order to pay off debts, the Liberian government allowed the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company to lease 1 million acres of its land for 100 years, which is 10% of the arable land. On this land, indigenous Africans were enslaved, enriching Firestone as well as the Liberian elite. African-American Pan-Africanist and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois said this about Liberia on his visit to the West African country. A body of local private capitalists, even if they are black, can never free Africa. They will simply sell it into new slavery to old masters overseas. And, as we can see, slavery by corporations with the complicity of the state has not ended. They have only evolved the institution by pushing it outside of the view of the people living in a cozy, developed world. Now, this brings me to the argument made by this type, that the West had ended slavery while the non-West or non-white countries continue to practice it. First of all, let's make this clear. Slavery has been legally abolished in every single country in the world. Now, does that mean that slavery does not exist? Of course not. So why is it that those in the West recognize their illegality of the institution, but disregard Africa and Asia's illegality of it? Secondly, not including the statism equals slavery argument, there are more than 35 million slaves in the world today, despite it being illegal in every country. In addition, the majority of these slaves are located in your non-Western underdeveloped countries. Now, at surface value, one would argue that it is the non-Western countries that are perpetuating slavery because that is where the plantations, factories, and mines with the enslaved labor are located. But before we jump to the conclusion that it is the non-Western nations of the world that are perpetuating slavery, one must ask themselves about the origin of their laptop that they are typing on, the clothes that they are wearing, and the cell phones that they do everything with. You see, the Western economic interests never intended on abolishing slavery. They simply pushed it off their boundaries to not be seen by their citizens. The slavery that exists all over the world is not so much to the benefit of the countries that the slaves exist in, but to the Western countries that are doing the enslaving by what is called neo-colonialism. This grip on nations is done through the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the overthrow of resistant governments by the Central Intelligence Agency, and other Western institutions that ensure that the labor and resources of the global South continue to flow into the coffers of the global North. And please, don't mention the aid that goes to Africa from Western countries. The aid actually flows in the opposite direction, from Africa to the so-called developed world. According to a study of a group of non-governmental organizations in 2014, while $134 billion in aid is brought into Africa each year, $192 billion worth is taken out of Africa due to profits made by transnational corporations, debts to international banks, reparations paid to France, and other generators of wealth for outsiders. This means that Africa has a net loss of $58 billion every year. But the Europeans love to say that they are doing Africans a favor. And much of these profits made by multinational corporations are generated from slave labor, like the millions who have been enslaved in the Congo since the late 1990s to produce the mineral coltan that makes our cell phones and laptops function. Have you ever asked yourself how much of the items in your house that you use on a daily basis are the products of slave labor? This is why those of the West, myself included, must not moralize on the notion that its modern systems are somehow superior to those of the past. And just because one can't see the slavery that is producing your product does not mean it is not happening. Just because you would like to think you have free markets does not mean that you actually do. As for the third point, I'm going to briefly address the claim that Africans were enslaving their own people. Now, it is always interesting to see people who couldn't name 3 countries in Africa and who have never cared about African history to all of a sudden become experts on the topic. Saying Africans enslaved their own people is equivalent to saying that Europeans during World War I went to war with their own people. But we don't really say that, do we? We tend to make distinctions between the individual European nations. We say the Germans fought the French, or the Russians fought the Austrians. But these types make it sound as if mothers were commonly selling their own children into slavery, or brothers selling brothers. The nature of the slave trade in Africa varied and depended on the location, the politics of the day, and their international demand to the particular African coastal regions. Many were sold into slavery as war prisoners. Others were sold into slavery as debtors. Some as criminals or outcasts in their respective communities, while others were kidnapped for the sole purpose of trading human cargo for European goods. Some historians argue that there were already a readily available reservoir of enslaved Africans, and this is the reason why Europeans chose Africa. Other historians argue that the new demand for labor in the Americas by the Europeans between the 16th and 19th centuries led to a growing war-driven economy, all seeking to take advantage of the new lucrative trade by selling war prisoners to Europeans on their coasts. However, when one examines closely, the majority of the coastal African societies that were in contact with the Europeans, they would find that upon arrival of these new trading partners, the coastal Africans lived in anti-hierarchical, anti-state simple societies, which any anthropologist will tell you are not prone to be slave societies. There is no mass production, there is no expansive commercial activity, and there is no wars of expansion in these simple societies, all of which are characteristics of slave societies. Now, once the Europeans arrived on the coast, some of the more simple societies, like the Akan people out of Kumasi, who would become the Ashanti Empire, or the Fon people out of Abomi, who would become the Dahomey Kingdom, would evolve into societies with large servile institutions and would become heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade by conquering the less formidable neighbors and selling the prisoners of war to the Europeans. However, one also must be careful in comparing chattel slavery in the Americas to the servile institutions in Africa. According to the historian Joseph Inikori, the so-called slavery in Africa can more so be equated to what the West has deemed as serfdom in Europe. There was also a degree of freedom associated with the status in Africa, like serfdom, and the servile status was usually not a life sentence, let alone a life sentence for all of your progeny in perpetuity, as it was for black people in America. In closing, I understand the sentiment that these types may feel. You may have been guilted into believing that you are responsible for the crimes of your ancestors, or the crimes of the people that may not even be your ancestors, but look like your ancestors. You don't have to be offended or triggered when someone comes along and says that Africans liberated themselves from slavery. That is not an indictment on you. That is just a fact of the past. History is not one of linear progress. It is one of ups and downs and ebbs and flows. And I tried to demonstrate here that only a people held in bondage can liberate themselves. No one can do it for them. Freedom cannot be given to anyone. It is something that one must fight for. The moment that your captor grants you your freedom, there is always going to be someone waiting to take that freedom, or someone else's freedom away. And fighting is what the African ancestors did. Whether it was fighting and forming maroon communities, slave revolts, or fighting in wars leaving governments with no choice but to recognize the African liberation, African people fought for their own freedom, and all people must continue to fight for their freedom. And like Albert Einstein once said, freedom, in any case, is only possible by constantly struggling for it. Signing off. Peace.